Alright, welcome to another live problem-solving exercise. This one is black to move, and in this position we're asked if black is better, worse, or winning, and we're given two moves to evaluate. We're given the capture on f4 and the move rook f to b8. A couple of general observations about the position to get us started. White is, at this moment, up a pawn, but this is an opposite sides castling position, so it's much more important how quickly one side can break through than that white has this extra pawn at the moment. Unless the queens are coming off or something like that, the speed of black's and white's relative attack is important. Obviously, white's castled on the king side and black's castled on the king side, and white really, or black really needs to find a way to open lines, which is why rook fb8 makes a lot of sense to me. This bishop on b5 and pawn on a4 are really sort of gumming up the works for black, so he'd be really happy to break down this structure in some way if possible so that he can start to make use of his open lines for his rooks and for his queen. His knights are also kind of stifled at the moment. He'd like to see this knight pawn on f4 go away somehow, so maybe he could drop a knight into e5, which is one argument in favor of capturing that pawn. White has a threat to capture this pawn here, and another observation that I would make is that white has a lot of light squares to target, and he's got a light squared bishop to take advantage of that. So he might like to put the knight on d5, for instance. This clamp on the white squares is really concerning to me, and I kind of think that if white is able to lock down the position and take advantage of these light squares without allowing black a breakthrough, he should be doing quite well indeed. So let's start off with rook fb8, and then I'll move on to the capture on f4. I believe that rook fb8 has a major threat. I think that if black were to move after rook fb8, he could capture immediately on b5, and then after the pawn on a4 captures on b5, rook a2 introduces what appears to be a devastating double attack on b2 to me. There's no way to block the queen from attacking b2. There's no way to defend b2. And once b2 goes, everything just seems remarkably loose, and white's king seems like it's going to be hunted for the rest of its very short days. So after rook fb8, I believe that rook captures b5 is an immediate and critical threat. In response, I think that we would want to consider the capture on g5, which is a forcing move, because it's going to threaten the queen. We may also consider moves like knight to e3, potentially, hopping into d5 or g4. Potentially we could consider a rook to double on the e-file, trying to trade rooks on e8, but I don't think that works very well, because I think that black's kings will probably able to just run up in most cases. White has a lot of control of the light squares, but not much of the dark squares, so the king is probably going to be safe on the dark squares in a lot of variations. Alright, so rook fb8, let's consider just this forcing move, the capture on g5. So after the capture on g5, black's queen is threatened, and I don't believe he has any way to ignore the threat to the queen, so he can either capture back with knight captures g5, or queen takes g5, or he could potentially move the queen to another square, like queen to f5. In this position, after rook to b8, pawn captures g5, my instinct is that black is doing quite well, and that after a move like knight captures g5, black is creating a threat to the rook on e4, and I believe he likely still retains his threats to capture on b5 in a lot of lines, and he may also just bring this other knight to e5. His knights have good control of the dark squares, and I don't see a way for white to break through in this position. The knight may also jump into something like f3, something like that. So I think that rook fb8 and the capture on g5 is probably not too dangerous for black. I could be wrong, I could be missing something huge, but I think that he could survive that possibly in a few ways. Possibly, I would say that I would try to avoid trading queens here after pawn captures, queen captures, because after the queens come off, black's rooks over here aren't going to have enough firepower to engage in some kind of breakthrough by rook takes b5 or something. So that seems like an issue to me. So otherwise, after rook fb8, let's say we have knight to e3. This move looks pretty appealing at first, but although we have great ideas to get into d5 and g4, it just doesn't seem to work, because after we capture on b5, pawn captures, now we have rook check, and the king's opened up, and the pawn on b2 is going to go, I think, after the king moves, very likely. Initially, it looks pretty good to me, although I am noticing that after rook b8, knight e3, rook takes b5, pawn captures, rook to a1. A rook capture on d1 isn't going to force king take d1, but may allow knight takes d1, after which it seems like white's holding his army together, and then the knight can come back to c3 or something like that. So maybe rook to b8, knight e3 is a good line for white. Rook to b8, knight to e3, and I'm not sure how black should follow up. Rook to b8, knight to e3. Well, maybe here the trick is that black now has the threat of rook take a4, which he's probably not getting away with otherwise, but after the knight moves, it's now impossible for the bishop to capture because queen take b2 is mate, because there's no more escape to d2. So rook to b8, knight to e3, rook takes a4 looks potentially strong to me. For instance, after rook takes a4, rook takes the bishop on b5, and black is sacrificed in exchange, but he has the threat to d2, although white does have defenses. And he may be able to capture on f4. I'm not sure. There's compensation here for black, I think, but it could still be very dangerous. So after rook to b8, I think a move like knight to e3 might hold black back, and he may not be able to sacrifice. If he can't sacrifice, I'm a little worried that black is just coming up short, and his rooks don't have really legitimate threats on the A and the B files. Rook to b8, knight to e3, and I'm not... It looks dangerous for white, but I'm not seeing the breakthrough. It looks like white has his squares covered. So if maybe rook b8, knight e3 isn't the end of the game, let's consider this capture on f4. I'm naturally very reluctant to capture on f4 because at a minimum, even if I win the pawn, I may be opening up the g file, and then white could potentially put a rook on the g file with a lot of play against my king. So So I'm reluctant to do this, but on the other hand, if I kill the pawn, maybe I can drop a knight into e5. That would be a much better square for the knight on f7 than the current square, obviously. It doesn't have much of a future, so maybe carving out a future, even if it comes at the cost of opening up my king, is okay. And again, white has really good control of the light squares, but not such good control of the light squares, so maybe it's possible to just hide the king on h8, even if the g-file is opened up. So pawn captures f4, and pawn captures f4. I think that I might be able to get away with knight captures f4. I'm not losing the knight by force, I don't think, because of queen g4 check. I can just go back, blocking the check. I've got the idea of playing my knight to e5, which will allow me to add the rook as a defender to the knight. And also, once I get this knight on f7 to e5, I could potentially swing it over to g6. And of course, I'm getting my pawn back, so if white's attack isn't breaking through, then maybe it's all just okay for me. Also, I potentially have, after capture captures, knight captures, some potential threats like knight to e2 check or knight to d3 check in some lines. For instance, rook to f1 might allow this discovery on the rook on f1 in some lines. Not here immediately, though, because the rook will be defended. I'm kind of conflicted. My natural instincts say rook to b8 is the right move to play, because I want to get play against the queenside castling position of whites. But on the other hand, concretely, I'm not seeing a way to break that down after rook to b8 and possibly knight to e3, possibly other moves. And if that's the case, maybe I want to keep the rook on f8 and just go about trying to steal a pawn on f4. Rely on good control of the dark squares to give me shelter on f8, and I'll have potentially a very strong piece posted on f4 that's going to be very hard to get rid of for white. I actually think that this position, after capturing on f4, looks playable for white, for black. I'm not sure who would be better. The position seems very messy to me. I think I might prefer to play black because I know where my pieces go a little more than I know where white's pieces go. And I like that after capturing an f4, I think I can get this knight to e5, and that seems like a very beautiful knight posting to me. This a4 b5 structure for white does really lock things down a little bit at the moment, but it also means that his structure is inflexible. At any time, it's possible that a sacrifice could open this structure up on the queenside very effectively for black, and the bishop struggles to get to a more active posting because it could lose the pawn on a4. The pawn on a4 is also very difficult to advance. All said, I have to stop calculating here, and I think that in this position I would play the capture on f4, and I think that of the two positions I would take black's position, but to be entirely honest, I would not be in the least surprised if the capture on f4 is a mistake and in some way white can tactically take advantage of it. But I don't see a way for white to take advantage of it, and I have to trust my calculation. So in a game here, I would play the capture on f4 despite my instinctive objections to opening the position up on the king side further here. I'll also point out that although I'm reluctant to open the position, I can't really prevent white opening the position further himself at some point, and so I may as well try to do so to open the position in the way that seems best for black here, possibly by grabbing that pawn and by forcing it immediately with the capture on f4. Well, I would consider this a pretty decent success. I'm very off in the valuation of the position. Uh, Black is definitely worse in this position, although I was optimistic about black's control of the dark squares. White is pressing quite a bit. I've been looking perhaps at too many Benoni positions and positions in which black defends despite a very open king, and in this case I'm pushing it too far. On the other hand, my evaluation of the moves is essentially correct. The move rook f(b8) does not break through. Queen e2 is very strong. Also, my move knight e3 is very strong as well. I looked at that with a computer. Both moves offer white a big advantage. With very little risk, black does not have any way to break through. If after rook f to b8 it were black's move in the position, rook take b5 would be very effective. But after queen e2 or knight e3 or a few other moves, it's not possible to play rook take b5, and black is making a mistake in pulling his rook away from the f-file. The move g take f4 is better. It is important to maintain the rook on the f-file to help with the capture of that pawn on f4. And so after capturing on f4, knight take f4, black does restore material equality, and he does get control of the e5 square. He's still worse. White's attack is the more legitimate attack, but he is able to get that pawn back and get important control of the e5 square. So g take f4 is definitely the better move.